afternoon. Kalisperasas. My name is Tom Papadimitriou, Professor of History at Stockton University. I have the honor of serving as the president of the Modern Greek Studies Association, or the MGSA, and I'd like to welcome you today to this event. For those who may not be familiar with the work of the Modern Greek Studies Association, the MGSA is a scholarly organization founded in 1968, and it highlights the study of the modern Greek tradition and Greek culture. It's interdisciplinary in scope and fosters the study of language, literature, arts, history, politics, economy, and society of modern Greece, Cyprus, and the Greek diaspora. While there are many important endeavors the MGSA organizes, the two most significant are the biennial symposium and the publication of the Journal of Modern Greek Studies. This year, because of the uncertainty related to the COVID-19 pandemic, the MGSA postponed our 27th symposium and rescheduled it to take place in person at York University in Toronto, Canada on October 13th through 16th in 2022. Please mark your calendars and look for the call for papers early in the coming year. Also associated with the symposium are numerous prizes for books and scholarship in the field that are worth your consideration. And here I just simply wanted to call your attention to our website, which is www.mgsa.org. And if you aren't a member, please consider joining, as well as those younger scholars who will find that there are great opportunities, especially for graduate students and others. The second important achievement of the MGSA is the publication of the Journal of Modern Greek Studies. And today is, in a sense, a celebration of the latest edition of the journal, volume 39, number 1, May 2021. The Journal of Modern Greek Studies is the official peer-reviewed publication that publishes critical analysis of Greek social, cultural, and political affairs covering the period from the late Byzantine Empire to the present. Its contributors include internationally recognized scholars in the fields of history, literature, anthropology, political science, Byzantine studies, and modern Greece. It's important here to note, with appreciation and gratitude, the work of the two editors of the journal, Dr. Andonis Elinas from the University of Cyprus and Dr. Johanna Hanink of Brown University. And as you review the new edition, you will see the high quality of the publication due very much to their hard work. I would also like to acknowledge the many anonymous readers, the scholars who accept to review the article submissions. This is often challenging work without which we would not be able to proceed. Thank you for that. To turn to today's event, in a sense, this is a celebration of the newest publication of the journal, as well as the recognition of the anniversary of the outbreak of the Greek Revolt in 1821. The editors had appropriately decided to plan a special section for this anniversary, and they called it 1821 in 2021, Rethinking the Birth of Modern Greece. They invited Dr. Yannis Koutsonis of New York University to be the guest editor and gathered scholarly contributions from whose authors you will shortly hear. The committee to put this together was chaired by Dr. Electra Kostopoulou of Rutgers University and the Federated History Department of the New Jersey Institute of Technology. It's also made up of Dr. Katerina Zacharia of Loyola Marymount University and myself, and assisted by Dr. Vangelis Kalotichos, the executive director of the MGSA. Here I simply want to acknowledge Vangelis for all of his hard work on behalf of the MGSA, and to acknowledge the work of the executive board for their input and support for today's event. Before I turn over the event to Electra, I was asked to read a message from Yannis Koutsonis, who is not able to attend today's event. His message, however, helps us frame today's discussion. He writes, "These articles are products of serious work and imagination. Collectively, they tackle the Greek Revolution from the margins of the master narrative that has been with us since the 19th century. That narrative has centered on what became Greece and projected backward a narrow understanding of Greece and Greekness, basically taking the Peloponnese and a few other regions as the new standard of the new nation. These articles approach it differently and in effect recenter the story. Greece as a product of the Holy Alliance, Greece as a literary movement of women no less outside of the Balkans, Greece as a deliberate process of truncation that occurred both in the Greek state and in the Ottoman Empire, and Greece as the warped memory of some extremist groups that are thankfully long in the past or in prison. I'll let the authors introduce themselves. Suffice it to say that we should be gratified. The bicentennial was celebrated in odd circumstances and with a very traditional wooden inflection, with all the familiar heroes and even some blatant inaccuracies about secret schools and Agia Lavra. Here we see historians at when best. They conduct serious research, engage the sources and the historiography critically, and from the margins give us a new appreciation of how Greece came to be. This was from Yannis Kotsonis. And so thank you to Yannis, to the editors, to the authors, and of course to today's respondents and discussants, and to all of you gathered today for this event. I look forward to the stimulating conversation to follow, and I hope to see you all in person in October 2022 in Toronto. Thank you. Electra, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and please excuse my somewhat unsuccessful attempts to share the MGSA page in the Journal of Modern Greek Studies, but I hope it was a vision as a reference. So I would like to invite Elisabeth Papalexopoulou to share her work with us today first. Elisabeth is a PhD student at the Department of History and Civilization at the European University Institute, and she's working on Greek intellectual women at the beginning of the 19th century. So, Elisabeth, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. This is very nice being here, although we're not all together, but in a way we are. Thank you for this invitation. It was very, very exciting. This is my first article, so it was even more exciting for me. And actually today I received the copy of the journal. So even more exciting. So thank you for this. Thank you for the invitation, Alex, Thomas, and Electra. And a big thank you to Yannis Kotsonis for his editor's work and to the two anonymous reviewers who really helped me transform this piece. So what I tried to do here was talk about women's political participation in the Greek Revolution. And this meant Greek women, which at first seemed something very simple, but then it became a bit complex because the first question was, of course, who were Greek women? And one of the things that's very, very salient is that these are women of the higher classes or some of merchant classes, but mostly higher aristocratic classes. And the other thing is that these were women who would not necessarily fit in to what we imagine as being Greek. And this also has shown in the historiography. So, of course, there are works about Evanthea Kairi or Elisabeth Martinegu who are seen as quintessentially Greek for some reasons. And then there are some works on the Phanariot, women of the Phanariot aristocracy. But there are no works in Greek, as far as I'm aware, about women who were in Italy. So these are women, again, of the higher classes, of the Corfiot aristocracy, usually who spent their lives between Corfu or the Ionian Islands and Venice or Padua at some cases. But including them, gave me a picture of these trans-imperial subjects who then became part of a revolution for a nation state, but who also thought of Greece in many, many different, very broad ways that are very interesting to look at. So this is what I tried to do. But I also tried to see what is different when we look at women. How are they different from their contemporaries? I think I will not say a lot about that so that people can read the journal article, but I think that it opened a door towards what a revolution means. And because this is the age of revolutions, as we call it, I think it opened a door for an understanding of revolutionary activity and revolutionary ideas as a lived experience done in many different ways. And since Yannis is not here, I'm going to rip him off and use one expression he used in his introduction. He said that these women were literary activists. And I think this is exactly what they were, because even though they tried to be modest and tried to be to present themselves as these people who wanted to fight for the Greek nation, but also they were below men. They did say these modest things, but also they went on being very, very open about their ideas and very frank and blunt. So one of the things they did would be writing and translating. Translation was, of course, a thing that was an open activity for women. They were allowed to do it, but also some of them wrote memoirs, like Elisaveta Martinegu did, or Roxandra Sturza, very different memoirs, but still. And many of them participated in societies, secret societies or Philhellenic societies, and tried to push in many different ways, sometimes disguising their work as philanthropic work, or sometimes openly doing revolutionary activities. And I think one of the most interesting cases is that of Roxandra Sturza, who was behind many things that happened in the Congress of Vienna and also behind the text of the Holy Alliance. This is also a teaser for you to read the actual article. I'm not going to go on for long because I don't want to take up too much time, but I think that there's been some work on women intellectuals in the 19th century by Sofia Denisi and Irini Rizaki. And this work was very, very important because they took down all the works, their publications, they found them, they uncovered them. But I think there's so much work to be done and so many questions to be answered about not how many women there were or how important their work was, but what they thought about the revolution and how they understood revolutionary activities, how they understood the connection between gender and revolutionary activities. And I think these can be traces of how the whole society saw the Greek Revolution and the other revolutions in Europe. And I think I'll stop at this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elisaveta, and we're all looking forward to the discussion. I would like to invite now Anna Karakatsouli. Professor Karakatsouli is an associate professor at the Department of Theatre Studies, the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. And she teaches mainly modern and contemporary European history and culture. Among her prolific work, I would like to highlight a particularly relevant title in Greek, for those of you who can read Greek, on the Greek War of Independence, entitled Freedom Fighters in 1821, a transnational approach to the Greek War of Independence. So Anna, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction. You are very kind. So my contribution focuses on current uses of the revolutionary legacy by the far right in Greece. I am dealing with the 20th and 21st centuries mainly. As the founding event of the modern Greek state, the 1821 War of Independence is a reference point for the political left and right. Both sides have claimed its memory, defending diverging readings of the national past that reflect contemporary challenges and political beliefs. Our argument focuses on lay representation of history and its use by politicians and opinion leaders, that is, on the kind of historical knowledge that circumvents academia and addresses the wider public. During the entire 20th century, the study and interpretation of the Greek War of Independence was mainly an issue debated by the Communist Party, its leaders and its intellectuals. The first Marxist analysis of 1821 date back to the early 20th century with the works by Georgios Skliros and Yannis Kordatos. They were incorporating the 1821 revolution in their revolutionary project in the Marxist theory of stages, and the vindication of the bourgeois revolution with the support of wealthy Greek merchants and ship owners meant for them and for the Communist Party in Greece that the way was now open for the next and final stage of class struggle, the socialist revolution. A few years later, during World War II and the Greek Civil War, the communist-led EAM, National Liberation Front, in search of unifying symbols, revived the 1821 theme to establish an analogy with Φιλική Εταιρεία of 1814. So the Greek Revolution was hence seen as a popular peasant rising against an oligarchy of landlords and the bourgeoisie. After the war in 1946, Georgios Valetas published the Betrayed 21, το προδομένο 21, in which he argues that the 1821 revolution had not been allowed to fulfill its objectives because native political corruption and xenocracy, he meant the British, betrayed the popular forces which had led the struggle against Ottoman rule. It is the same struggle now as then, wrote Valetas, and is led by popular leaders and EAM, the new Φιλική Εταιρεία, against despotism and undemocratic reaction, which in the 20th century had taken the form of fascism. The final outcome of the Civil War and the severe repression of the left during the following decades eclipsed the debate on 1821 in the public sphere, and the Greek Revolution was incorporated into the official authoritarian state ideology. While the left aspired to a holistic approach that could organically link the Greek Revolution to its Marxist-inspired revolutionary vision, in the radical right perspective, historical periods and facts are presented selectively and in direct relation to the present time. History is instrumentalized to build support and legitimacy, to present illiberal regimes as heirs of the glorious ancestral past and as defenders of the nation. In the Greek cases, as it is known, we witnessed two such periods in contemporary history, the 4th of August regime in 1936 and the colonel's dictatorship in 1967 to 74. They both stressed the military ideals of 1821 fighters and strove to be recognized as the true successors of these valiant ancestors. In the 21st century, the field of Greek lay history on 1821 seems monopolized by the far right. Far-right parties like Laos and Golden Dawn intervened loudly in the public sphere as defenders of national identity against the falsification of national history. Charged with anti-Turkish elements, Ottomans being misleadingly identified with Turks, far-right discourse on 1821 pinpoints the notions of patriotism and the defense of national sovereignty, as well as iconic figures like Athanasios Diakos or Nikitaras. Hateful rivalry with Turkey is a new component of far-right ideology in Greece that emerged after the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974 and was exacerbated after the Imia military crisis in January 1996. In Golden Dawn's discourse, the Greek Revolution is unique in its features and unparalleled national struggle for freedom betrayed by foreign intervention. In his 2018 article entitled 1821, A Betrayed Revolution, surprisingly echoing Valetas' brochures, Michaloliakos rejected the falsification of history by the Marxist tyranny, as he says, as well as any similarities between the Greek Revolution and the French or Soviet ones. A year earlier, on the English version of the site, he was declaring that these latter revolutions were both mere civil wars, while the Greek Revolution had been a just war between two different nations. To stress this point, he ended his text emphatically with the words of Kolokotronis against traitors, which have been adopted as one of Golden Dawn's favorite slogans, fire and aches to the subservient. Φωτιά και τσεκούρι στους προσκυνημένους. In the context of the deep ongoing economic, social and refugee crisis in Greece, national identity, national culture and pride in national history became political issues mobilizing public opinion and complementing socio-economic and political institutional factors. The far-right approach implicates an issue ownership strategy as it claims to be the only authentic heir and vindicator of national history and identity. On the occasion of the bicentennial celebration, numerous conferences, books, and exhibitions greatly enhanced our scholarly understanding of the revolution. This, however, did not necessarily impede the instrumental use of 1821 as a strategic frame for right-wing extremists and nationalists, nor the attempt to connect widely recognizable characters and events to their cause. By vacating the field, the left abandoned civilization, history, and identity issues to the right, to be deployed in the services of nationalistic and anti-democratic ambition. And this is something I believe we should take into serious consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very timely presentation. And now we will move to the work of Professor Dalia. Ada Diale is a professor of European and Russian history at the Department of Theory and History of Art, School of Fine Arts in Athens, Greece. And there are many things we could mention about her very distinguished career, but I would like to just highlight that she has been a founding member and chairman of the Athens-based Governing Board Research Center for the Humanities. And her most recent book, which is co-authored with Alexis Iraklidis, is entitled Humanitarian Intervention in the Long 19th Century, Setting the Precedent, Manchester University Press, 2015. So Ada, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Electra. It's very nice to be with you. I would like to thank the Journal of Modern Greek Studies for this invitation, with special thanks to Electra for her efforts in organizing this meeting. Also, I would like to thank the editor of the special issue, Professor Yanni Kotsonis, and the two anonymous reviewers for their valuable contribution to the final version of my article. My initial problematic, as I began thinking of this article, regarded two issues, two questions. The first question was linked with the chronological confines of the revolutionary phenomenon of 1821. Should historians start the narrative of the revolution with Ypsilantis and end up with Capodistria? Or the 1881 was start of a longer and larger process of structural changes in the Mediterranean region, which involved the politics of the major European empires of that time, and especially the Ottoman, the Napoleonic, and the Russian empires. In my opinion, the problematic on the empires gave a fresh look to the Vienna Congress and the Holy Alliance. Until recently, the Congress of Vienna was discussed only marginally in connection to the Greek Revolution, and usually, stereotypically, as no more than a conference leading to restoration. However, the systematic inclusion of the Congress of Vienna and the system that followed it in the study of revolution produced a number of interesting alternative perspectives to the very ideas of restoration and legitimacy, the source of sovereignty, slavery, human rights, humanitarianism, intervention, and finally to the concept of revolution as one very closely associated with the idea of Europe, as a source of fear or, on the contrary, as a source of hope. In this perspective, the Vienna Congress period could be seen less as an interruption of revolutionary movements and more as a moment that produced new ones, including the Greek one. My inspiration for the above was the rereading and alternative readings which were produced in recent years, and especially on the occasion of the bicentenary of the Vienna Congress. The new approaches and insights present a far more ambivalent image of the Vienna, and not simply as an attempt to set back the clock of history to the period prior to the French Revolution. New approaches invite us to think this period from the angle of discontinuity with the pre-revolutionary era and not as continuity. They invite us to understand the period not as a restoration, but as an act of instituting or establishing something new, which includes eclectic references to the past, the present, and the future. The second issue which I had in my mind was the Russian-Greek nexus. Conventional wisdom in the relevant Greek historiography understand the role of the Russian Empire and the Greek-Russian transcultural and political relations from a limited and somewhat dubious perspective, i.e., as the long-term traditional relations between co-religionists in a shared Orthodox world. Russian involvement in 1821 is downgraded in Greek historiography, and this is something that needs to change, for, contrary to the stereotypes that regard Russia on the margins of European experiences, the Russian long 19th century, the golden age of the Russian imperial history, instead places Russia at the center of the post-Napoleonic era with a catalytic role on virtually all European issues. Russia, in the weight of its military campaigns against Napoleon's empire at the Congress of Vienna, found itself in a leading position in European politics and as the pace setter in the elaboration of the idea of a united Europe. Here I refer to the text of the Holy Alliance as initially conceived by the Tsar Alexander I and not as changed and consolidated by none other than the arch-conservative Metternich. It was in the Congress of Vienna that Russia asserted itself as a European power in the political, cultural, philosophical terms. This was a Russian moment in the 19th century European affairs. In addition, the study of transnational personalities, such as the Ionian aristocrat Ioannis Kapodistria, as a Russian diplomat who was involved not only in European but in global power politics, is crucial. For example, regarding the Ottoman Empire, the Russian mission in Vienna, triggered by the Serbian case, codified a series of arguments on the non-legitimacy of the Sultan's rule with regard to the Christian population of the Ottoman Empire. 7 years later, these arguments will prove to be very useful on the lips of the Greek revolutionaries and of those who supported the Greek case and the Greek cause. This is what I had to say for the moment. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And again, we're all looking forward to the discussion. But for now, I would like to conclude the presentations by inviting Professor Torunoglu, Berke Torunoglu, to share with us his work, last but not least, for sure. Berke Torunoglu is a historian specializing in the social and political history of the modern Middle East, with a particular focus on the history of the Ottoman Empire. His first book, Murder in Salonika, 1876, A Tale of Apostasy and International Crisis, in a way focuses on the events that led to the revolutions of the post-national revolutions in the Ottoman Empire. But as of lately, he's focusing on political subjects, more specifically within the Ottoman work. His current book project, tentatively titled Strange Subjects of the State, Neo-Hellenists and Neo-Russians in the Ottoman Empire, 1830-1876, examines the formation of Ottoman nationality during the Tanzimat era, the era of reforms. Berke, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to thank everyone who's been thanked before. Rather than going through all the names, I thank you, Elektra, in the person of Elektra, for making this happen, and for all of you for being here. So I would like to give a tease on my article and really maybe intellectually salivate you for read more on the subject. So in my work, I claim that the Ottoman Nationality Law of 1869 was enacted to legalize expulsion and eradication of unwanted populations from the Ottoman Empire. These, in quotation marks, not my words, unwanted populations were subjects of the Ottoman Empire who claimed foreigner status in their native land, legally or illegally obtaining necessary documents of naturalization from foreign governments. So you can guess where this discussion is going. So, of course, most of these foreign subjects were native Greeks. So that made things very complicated for everyone involved. So it is mostly the sources and what happened that really pushed me to focus on the Greek experience on the Ottoman Empire. So mainly I chose to focus on what was by then deemed Neo-Hellenes. So this is an idiom that the French came up with to mitigate this categorical nightmare. Neo-Hellenes were Greeks who obtained Greek nationality but still continued to live on the Ottoman Empire. So, and these people, according to some, around the late 19th century, were 500,000 strong. So we're dealing with a huge population here. So in my work, in my article, I just deal with the judicial aspect of Neo-Hellenes. But in my book that will be one day published, I'll deal with Neo-Hellenes and Neo-Russians as well. So because these subjects occupy the Ottoman bureaucracy the most, and they directly contributed to the formation of an Ottoman nationality by dragging respective states, the Hellenic Kingdom and Russia, to the negotiation table. So in my article, I laid out the connection between the Ottoman Nationality Law of 1869 and the plans for expulsion of Neo-Hellenes from the empire. This connection, I can now safely say, after 10 years of research, has never been discovered in scholarship. On the contrary, Ottoman Nationality Law was considered as a liberal policy of the state, paving the way for citizenship and political participation. I cannot underline this enough, it was not. The Ottoman state was instead primarily concerned with putting an end to the increasing number of former Ottoman subjects who opted for foreign nationalities, just like I said. And the overwhelming majority of these subjects were Greeks. So I historicize in this article the wholesale expulsion orders of Greeks from the Ottoman Empire in a nutshell. This is the crux, which unsurprisingly coincides with the enactment of the nationality law. Starting from 1830s, the inaugural day for the judicial studies on the Hellenic Kingdom, I worked my way up to late 19th century in order to understand the rationale behind the Greek expulsions and the law itself. So indeed, although some 1,000 families, around 1,000 families were expelled in 1869, the empire did not manage to force out every last Greek in 1869. And the expulsion failed to reach a conclusion because of foreign pressure and myriad of distractions and court intrigues. But the Ottoman nationality law, we can elaborate this further in the Q&A, never lost its potency, remained virtually unchanged, providing the legal basis for the Greek-Turkish population exchange of 1923. As a matter of fact, while I was looking for the inventory registers at the Ottoman archives, the last person before me who checked out the Greek expulsion records was a member of the Turkish delegate at the Lausanne conference. So there is little doubt in my mind, as scholarly as it can get, treated as a most educated guess that an Ottomanist can have. There is a deliberate policy against the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, from 1830s to, let's say, 1890s, when the Ottoman-Greek War happens. And even victorious, the Ottoman realized they cannot really keep the Greeks out. And we may speculate endlessly on that in the Q&A. So I'll leave it at that. And I'm looking forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you so much. And as a fellow Ottomanist myself, I'm very interested in the questions and the discussion as well. So it is now our task, mine and Professor Tippeis, Alex Tippei and myself will try to very, very briefly summarize what we think emerges from your contributions and ask a few introductory questions. Those of us who would like to, those of you who attend this panel and would like to ask questions, let me just explain very briefly how we would like to invite you to share questions with us. If you scroll down, you should be able to see a Q&A symbol right on your screens. So if you want to ask any questions to any of the panelists, please type your questions there and we'll share them with the panel. Okay, so please type in the chat version doesn't work for this discussion. Please type in the Q&A section. But back to the essence of our discussion. So we're here today to talk about revolution. And revolutions are hardly ever simple linear transitions from one political system to another. This is naturally true for the first iconic revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th centuries that transformed not only the regions within which they occurred, but also world networks, dynastic networks, among other things, in multiple ways. These early revolutions, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and I would like to add the Serbian and Greek revolutions as unique phenomena, formed disruptions, or included rather disruptions, clashes, negotiations, and the manifold, at times self-contradictory reinvention of political, ideological, and economic sensibilities. Hence, in my attempt to bring all of these wonderful contributions together today, I would like to highlight that aspect of the story. Transnational sensibilities, maybe, which is a key word I saw emerging in your work collectively. Something very specific and at the same time quite universal, right? One very specific and at the same time quite universal aspect of the Greek Revolution of 1821 could be identified in the incomplete mutual changes that occurred in between individual subjects and their environments, political, ideological, economic, and so on and so forth. And these changes, these incomplete mutual influences between individual subjects and their environments were at once normative, prescriptive, literal, and metaphorical. So listening to you and after reading your wonderful articles, this is what I'm getting as a common thread in the discussion, the transnational aspect of 1821, back then, right, in the early 19th century and today, as well as the question of the interaction between individual subjects and the changes occurring within them and within their own cosmos and understanding of the world, and the environment that inspired them and was also changed by them. So Elisavet's work forms a truly fascinating contribution in this sense, reminding us of the gender aspect of sensibility, right? And emphasizing in particular the pluralistic characteristics of the phenomenon she engages with. Her work very elegantly shows that there were direct connections between the philanthropic activities of upper class women in the context of Greek nationalism and the European Enlightenment. My question to you, Elisavet, revolves precisely around that point. If we were to identify something that was unique about the Greek experience by comparison to the larger phenomena unfolding at the time everywhere from Europe to Russian and Ottoman empires to the Americas, could you identify something that was perhaps unique to the Greek phenomenon, if it's not too complex a question? And could you very briefly comment on the different perspectives, if any, that national historiography or literal works included regarding gender, if we were to compare the works of women to the works of men? In other words, if we were to identify the emergence of national gender in that context, are there any differences in how men versus women envisioned and understood the ideal role women had to play in the context of all these transformations? And on the note about different perceptions of nationalism, of course, I would like to now move to Anna's wonderful and very, very timely discussion of different perceptions of nationalism, historical agency, and the contemporary uses and appropriations of 1821 by the far right, a topic that is extremely important and also very difficult to address, considering its sensitive and contemporary nature. So my question again revolves around contextualization, right? And reading your article, I kept thinking about broader developments in the world. So how unique is this reappropriation of history, or rather of a really iconic moment in the history of one nation state, the very revolution that produced it? So how unique is this reappropriation right now in the 21st century? And I'm thinking of examples, anything from Turkey's Erdogan, right, and his engagement with Ottoman history, to Vladimir Putin in Russia, reviving narratives about the Third Rome and reclaiming the European Enlightenment, among other things, to everything that's happening in the US today, right? Moderate conservative reinventions of history and far-right reinventions of American history. And also back to Europe, anything from so-called centrist conservatism, Macron revisiting French history as the most iconic moment in European and perhaps global history, and so on and so forth, to the rise of the far right. So what are the connections, if any? And speaking of the devil, and the devil would be always Russia when we're having a discussion about anything really in the US, usually. We move to Ada's fascinating argument regarding the role of Russia and its not only the transnational element, but also the dynastic participation, so often overlooked, as she very well reminds us, and reproducing empire, among other things, in the context of 19th century transformations. So again, if we were to connect your discussion to more contemporary phenomena, right, and building on Anna's argument, why do we overlook the Russian influence? Because as you very well say, once we engage with the archives, it's always there. And yet for a very long time, we have focused on Western Europe and mainly the British influence in the context of the system of great powers, overlooking the obvious, very, very central role Russia played until the very end, until the Bolshevik Revolution, perhaps, in the context of reimagining and transforming these dynastic networks in order to serve their own version of empire, even enlightenment back then as well as today. So I feel, reading again your work, that they identified almost a post-Cold War exclusion of Russia from everything that happened in the 19th century. And I would love to hear more about that, like shifting the focus. And last but not least, for sure, moving to Burke's extremely interesting and original argument about the Ottoman nationality law, and his attempts to revisit imperial strategies, right, in order to produce coherent identities in an empire that was shattered from within at the time. So Burke presents a fascinating argument here, again, connecting the regional story to much broader trajectories. And I would love to hear more about that fascinating connection between the population exchange of 1922 and what you present here as a consistent policy of exclusion. And I think your argument is very convincing. I would love to hear more about that. And at the same time, to play the devil's advocate, I would like to invite you to problematize a little bit your characterization of it as a non-liberal policy, or rather, what does liberal mean to you, right? Because many of the liberal strategies in saving the empire, in the service of empire at the time, whether that's the British Empire or the Ottoman Empire or even the Russian Empire and so on and so forth, entailed a very conservative element of exclusion, because at the end of the day, it was a system in serving nationalism or empire or both of them. And Venizelos, for instance, Eleftherios Venizelos, if we are to move back to 1922 and the population exchange and all that, he was inspired by, I would argue, his Ottoman experiences in Crete, right, where he matured politically. He was the main representative of the liberal movement in the Ottoman Empire, and as I'm sure you know, the main advocate in favor of the exchange of population. So that was perhaps a liberal tradition, and it invites us, your work invites us to rethink about what liberal meant in that context as well, among other things. So that's all I had to say for now, at least. And before you respond, I would like to invite Professor Tippei, Alex Tippei, to share also some thoughts with you. A transnational historian of 19th century Europe, Alex Tippei's research focuses on the relationship between the exercise of French soft power and the rise of nationalism in Southeastern Europe, notably the lands that make up today's Greece and Romania. She's currently an assistant professor of history and international studies at the University of Montreal. Alex, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Electra. And I'd like to thank everybody, and particularly Electra, for inviting me to comment on this panel. And also especially for giving me the opportunity to read these articles sort of together as a group in a way that I might not have otherwise. And for me, I think a couple of things emerged, and my viewpoint will be not the same as Electra's, perhaps complementary at the same time. So one thing I noted is that even though this is a cluster called 1821 and 2021, very little of the analysis actually focuses on 1821. And the other thing that I took away from that is that it kind of points to one way that we can narrate the development of Greek nationalism and national identity. And that's as a progressive winnowing of these concepts over time. So if you look at this group, for example, of papers, we can begin with what Elizabeth describes as a connected but fragmented Hellenism, that she also calls a form of cosmopolitan patriotism. And in the end, we end up chronologically and conceptually with Anna's discussion of how in the 20th and 21st centuries, the extreme right has mobilized the memory of 1821, and that they've done this to promote political ideologies steeped in notions of ethnic purity, xenophobia, and religious homogeneity. In other words, we move over the course of time, and in the analysis presented in this month's journal, we move from universalist ideas of Greekness to a narrow ethno-linguistic and religious understanding of it. Yet, as each of our panelists' articles shows, this progression was neither linear nor uncontested. And for me, I think one way to understand this tension is to think of the story of modern Greek nationalism and national identity as the result of two overlapping and interconnected, but yet distinct processes. And I think on the one hand, it's the story of a civic understanding of belonging, the kind of idea that we see elaborated in the writings and deeds of figures like Rigas, who thought of themselves as part of the Romaios community, had ties across the region, and imagined peoples from all over the Balkans with various linguistics and sometimes even religious backgrounds coming together to forge a new state and society. The universalist aspirations of this project could also be shared beyond Southeastern Europe. For example, in gatherings organized by Venetian saloniers, Russian diplomats, or even Parisian liberals, where the notion that nous sommes tous les Grecs had a real imaginative currency. I think also calling the War of 1821, moreover, a revolution is a label which I find both problematic but not entirely inaccurate. What it does is, as Electra noted, places it in the same genealogy as the American and French revolutions, movements consciously styled at the time and in the historiography as being predicated on universal understandings of civilization, natural rights, and civic nationalism. So I think that's one story. The other story is the story of Greek national identity in the 19th century as the rise of ethno-nationalism. And this is a phenomenon that develops in the Balkans at the intersection of global politics, continental diplomacy, and regional realities. In this story, Vienna looms large, and as Ida points out, Congress participants might not quite have been quite as conservative as we've traditionally thought of them, but they were by no means radicals. And any attempt, I think, to curry support for some kind of independence had to avoid a smacking of the rhetoric of universalism that underwrote the revolutionary France and Napoleon's campaigns. Moreover, the insurgents in 1821's inability to create a broad coalition across the peninsula, I'm thinking here, for example, of Ypsilantis and Vladimir Escu, their inability to create coalition coupled with the creation of a Greek nation state set a precedent. And what it did was it brought to end sort of grandiose designs in the spirit of Byzance après Byzance, built often on civic or ecumenical forms of nationalism. And it demonstrated to Orthodox leaders across the peninsula that properly situated appeals to ethnocentric and linguistic nationalism, generally linked to Christianity, could garner great power support for increased autonomy and independence. As Berke shows, this is a process that also impacted how Ottoman officials understood themselves in the world. And so this second story of Greek nationalism is one of a more conservative, exclusivist conception of Greek identity that distinguished the Greeks from their neighbors and continued to gain ground as Greek irredentist schemes met with resistance over the course of the following decades. While this second story about Greek nationalism may have been ascendant in the post-1821 world, I think that the two narratives continue to coexist and to inform one another. I think the first story also persists as a reminder of not just what could have been, but also of the possible. And I think we see evidence of all of this in all of the articles in this collection, whether it's the way Greek-speaking diplomats in the service of the Tsar tweaked the language of revolution, for example, or how the Greek state conceived of neo-Hellenes outside its borders as potential co-nationalists, while Ottoman officials simultaneously continued to think of them as members of the Rum Millet. So what I would like to sort of ask of you today is I have a couple of specific questions for each of you, but in general, I'd like you to invite all of our contributors to reflect broadly on how this tension between a universalist understanding of Greekness on the one hand and a more limited conception of Greek identity predicated on ethno-linguistic nationalism appears in their sources and also in their approach to their subjects. And then more specifically, Elizabeth, first of all, your article offers the most extensive discussion of the kind of cosmopolitanism we often associate with universalist civic forms of nationalism. And the actors you study are incredibly mobile, routinely spending long periods of their life in different geographic and linguistic milieu. And I noticed that you underline how some of them claim not only multiple identities, but also multiple homelands. For instance, you note that Ruxandros Sturza referred to both Russia and Greece this way. And so I'm kind of wondering, what is this alternance about? Is it situational? Is it contextual? Does it depend on the audience that she's thinking of or the moment she's describing? And similarly, I would ask Ada, I found your argument that the language of revolution and enlightenment took on a double meaning really interesting. And I was hoping you could talk more about this. And I also wondered if Kapodistrias, Tsar Alexander, and other figures consistently use these concepts themselves in different moments or when addressing different audiences and in various languages, or if their use of these ideas also depended on context. Berke, something that really piqued my interest in reading your text was how class may or may not have factored into all of this. At a few points, you allude to the economic interests of these individuals, but I'm curious if we're only dealing with affluent populations. And if so, how did both the Ottoman and Greek state view less well-off Orthodox Christians? Were they desirable Neo-Hellenes? How were they seen from both sort of sides of the sea? And finally, Anna, I think that your article really highlights how the right has claimed ownership of a particular interpretation of 1821. And I know that you focus on popular discourse rather than academic debates in the text, but I'm sort of wondering what space you might see for historians to participate in these discussions, and if sort of emphasizing a more universalist understanding of 1821 that had animated the thinking of so many actors up to that point might serve as a starting point. So those are sort of the questions that I had in mind. Afterwards, I feel like Electra and I may have a long debate later about revolution, but that's another story, and I'll let you guys respond.
Okay. Thank you so much, Alex. And there's no question about our unlimited ability to talk forever. But I would like to invite our panelists to respond before we collect a few questions from the audience. And again, those of you who would like to share a question or make a remark perhaps with us, please try to do it in the Q&A, right? If not, you can use the chat and we'll try to include it. So would you like to go in the same order you presented? Yeah, so we can start with Elisabeth. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. These are lovely questions. I hope I do them justice. So the first one about the uniqueness of the Greek Revolution. Of course, there are specific things, and this is a very big discussion, but my perception of it is that this was an effort the Greek revolutionaries made consistently to prove that they are not like the Carbonari, that they are not like the people who are trying to upset the status quo. They are, God-fearing people who want to just connect with the Christian populations. And an example for me in the sources is, I'm thinking of Evanthia Kairi and how she wrote these letters to Philhellenes, and some of them had a great reach in the United States. It's amazing. And then some Protestants also sent missionaries after the end of the revolution. This is a really nice story. But so in these letters to Philhellenes, she keeps talking about, the Christian Europe that's watching us being slaughtered by Ottomans. We're Christians. She doesn't make any allusion to any other kind of injustice happening. This is just Christians being, the border to Islam, etc., etc. But we all know that both Evanthia Kairi and her brother were not that kind of Christians. And they supported not deism, but this Theosebia that Theophilos had made. And also, because I've read extensively her personal correspondence, I don't think Christianity is part of her identity so much. She doesn't really care about it that much. And she ended up being buried outside the Christian cemetery in the end. So I think the uniqueness, this is to say that this uniqueness that's many times described as a connection with Christianity, I think it was partly, or for some of the actors, it was a way to negotiate this difficulty of having a very small group of people actually fighting with a large empire at an age where, empire seemed the only political alternative. I don't think anyone could imagine the thing that happened. It was very outside people's perceptions then. So this will bring me to Alex's question, if I'm allowed to go a bit back and forth, about Sturza and her nationality and the way she changes. Of course, it's situational, and of course, it has to do with her audience. But also, I think we tend to assign to it a bit more of an importance than it had for them, because for them, nationality didn't have to be exclusive, as it later on became. So it was okay for her in the same text in her memoir to cry about her Greek homeland and then to cry about her Russian homeland. For her, it's not exclusive. she can constantly write in French and never use Greek, but still feel Greek. It's okay for her. It's not a question for her. I hope this answers at least partially the question. And then, Electra, I think you asked about the difference between men and women.
Very briefly,
Yes.
because in your article, you very nicely highlight how they saw, their role in this national uprising or intellectual
Yes.
or actual. And similar works written by men prioritize different aspects of the female contribution. If you would like to comment on that a little bit, or not.
Yes, I'd love to. Thank you for the question.
Prioritize or not, I meant.
So I think there's no methodological reason to actually group women's work together. And I have this hope, I think many women's historians share this hope that at some point we won't need to have these very specific articles saying what women did at this and this time. But we could present them all together and have this mosaic of what was going on. But on the other hand, of course, women faced specific kinds of material and social restrictions. And this is then the uniqueness of their work. Because even though they might have had different ideas about language, about where Greece was, about what should be done, some of them were more conservative, some of them were more revolutionary, but they all were part of a marginalized group in a way. And I think one of the most interesting things when you're looking at the revolution is looking at how these marginalized groups take this hope of the revolution and feel it in their bones, because they think that change also means change for them. And so most of the women, I mean, Elisabeth Martinengo reminds us more of a feminist kind of speech, the way she writes. But generally, they seem to me to believe that if all of this repression of women has to do with Islam and the Ottomans, and when a new polity emerges, the Greek polity, which will be very European and very ancient Greek, then, of course, women will have a very different place. Now, we all know this never happened, actually, but they didn't know it. And I think you can see in the writing this hope, which is a false hope many marginalized groups have during revolutions. And I think, for example, Eleni Varikas has highlighted this when she talks about the pariahs in the French Revolution. I think that's the most touching and the most interesting part when you're looking at women's work. I think I don't remember if there were any more questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And we can return to many of these issues if we have some time. Anna, would you like to respond? Thank you.
Okay, all over again. So these were very interesting questions indeed. The uses and abuses of history is perhaps the most common feature of alt-right internationally. We meet this same discourse everywhere. The reference change naturally. It may be Jeanne d'Arc in France or the Vikings for the Nordic people, but the essence of the discourse and the approach is the same. We are a chosen people, exceptional by birth, by blood and history, and we are in threat. We are endangered. Enemies are attacking us, and these enemies may be refugees, this international global jihad, anything. The Jewish bankers, everything goes in this kind of discussion. And we have to also take into consideration that the alt-right has its own networks. It is in constant contact and exchange with other groups, far-right extremist nationalist groups all over the world. So they share a common vocabulary. And in Greece, of course, we have this classical past that is very heavy on our soldiers. The main historical subject that interests the far-right groups in Greece is, of course, antiquity, and most specifically Sparta. This is natural. This is the military ideal. The 81 suited well both the dictatorships we had, Metaxas and the colonels. Because Metaxas had this ideal of the third Hellenic civilization and had to incorporate specific seminal moments of history in his own vision. And he tried to compare himself to Capodistrias, for example. And while the colonels adopted the 21 symbol, the dictatorship was declared on the 21st of April, and even the hymn of the junta played upon this connection, the 21st of April and the 21 of the revolution. So this is the standard point that we keep coming back. This is a rather slippery subject, however, because much of the material is based on the websites, the blogs they have on the internet, and these are regularly banned. They restore them, they change the name a little, and they put them back on the net, but you have to constantly look for them. It's not given. And as far as the discussion on these topics they raise, professional historians, academic historians do not engage with them, do not enter into dialogue with these positions. First, because they are not by historians. The main authors that write the articles in their magazines are mostly ex-army officers or retired educators, so they have not the formation and the rigidity of methodology we would like to discuss about. And then it's a possible threat. The use of violence is very usual in these groups, and no professor I know of would like to have such a to open a dialogue with that field. She feels insecure. So they prefer to leave it alone. But what the bell I would like to ring is that this kind of history keeps gaining audience. We see it in book fairs, for example. There is a huge crowd in front of the stands that sell that kind of books, and while respectable publishers of academic history are all alone behind their desk. So it's something we should think about more seriously nowadays. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And those of us who are familiar with developments in Greek academia fully appreciate how brave these decisions are. So thank you for doing that. And Ada, if you would like to respond as well, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Electra, your question is very interesting and points to the head of the historiographical problem of the Russia. Russia seems to be an eternal historiographical problem. From the second part of the 19th century, Russia placed at the edge of the European history. This is a periphery, and Eurocentric history does not know what to do with the peripheries. So this is the main problem. And after that, the second layer, Cold War perceptions, and now I think that we live in the post maybe Cold War perceptions. So there are a lot of stereotypes about Russian history, and it concerns that the idea that Russia is inherently absolutist and without, let's say, liberal ideas, or there is a separate state and society, and the society does not exist. But this is not the point, and if we study carefully this the history of Russia, we can understand that it is a part of European experiences, if we can speak of European experiences in the plural and not in the Western tendency. So I think that we have to re-examine without stereotypes the Russian history and this nexus of Greek-Russian relations, transnational, transcultural, and so on, from the point of view of the age of revolution, and not only from thinking of peripheries, but thinking of the central themes of this range of revolution. Greece and Russia are very central in this history. And this is my point, and this is my whole work that I want to do. And I think that is what I have to say about your question. If there is something more to say, please say it to me. Okay. And speaking about Alex's question, I have to say that this vocabulary of nation, of rights, human rights, humanitarianism, it is a vocabulary of the making. And of course, Alexander I and the Capodistrias and other people, they used this vocabulary in different ways, in different contexts. But I think that it is not because they are politicians and they want to do so. I think that the time of revolution was very, very, very interesting time, and the moments were changing, constantly, and it was very difficult to have one idea about one concept. And about regarding the concept of nation, I think that at that time we have to connect two different concepts: the concept of people and the concept of nations. And this is a very difficult and slippery connection. This is what I have to say about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, moving from the one misunderstood empire to the other, Berke, would you like to respond on?
Yeah, the questions were excellent and made me felt validated, because these are the questions that I've been trying to emphasize on trying to answer in my work as well. So let me start with the easiest and work my way to the one that I have list to say. First, let me define liberal and what I meant by liberal policies. First, this is, I personally live in 19th century, so I know more about 19th century than the age that I live in. So for 19th century perception, nationalism is liberalism. So as opposed to like imperialism, at least giving some sort of a right, and as opposed to just duties, asking for duties from the individual, which is the core of nationalism, was a liberal policy. That's why like Springtime of Nations in mid-century was a liberal movement. But if you read them, they are very cringeworthy now. They pretty much talk about how like the Hungarian nation is the first nation, like the Germans are superior to whatever the other nation that speaks German, etc. So that's a bit what I can say is liberal. And the Ottomans, in their attempt to at least counter this liberalism of nationalism, I know this is a bit muffled, they try to do more Greek nation as well.
Sorry, if we could all mute ourselves. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I will not go too much into detail, but in their attempt to at least enact some liberal laws, they divided their nations, which is interesting enough. the same word in Turkish that is millet. Millet is nowadays used as nation and not as a confessional community. There's this confusion that started in the 19th century. And they defined them in terms of ethno-linguistic and definitely in terms of confessional borders, and enacted laws and gave them pretty much enacted bylaws, if you have to be very technical, in order to give them at least some sort of a participation in state. So that's been dealt with. I hope I can just go on that, but let me move on to other questions. So about the policy of exclusion on Greeks, this is a bit tough to answer to. I don't really see that there is a exclusion really, and you cannot really find these things in written form, of course. The famous saying of a Turkish politician, there is no receipt for a bribe. So these things are hush-hush anyway. So, but I mean, if you look at the Phanariots who were diligently working the Ottoman Empire to the very end days, and how prominent some of them, not just Phanariots, but self-made Greeks were in this time period, I cannot really, at least as a historian, make that claim. But there is this notion that all the Tanzimat men, all the reformers of 19th century were people who came from the translation bureau, the bureau in the Ottoman Empire whose only task was to translate usually French and English documents into Ottoman Turkish for the state's consumption. And the former staff was almost exclusively Greeks. When the revolution happened in 1921, they were, of course, either died, fled, or faced a milder fate. And they were also now replaced by Muslim Turks, whose native one was Turkish. And they inherited this position with maybe some inherent bias towards Greeks as well. So the chief among them is Ali Pasha, the man who is considered like coterminous with Tanzimat, who went through the same time period, replacing the Greeks. So there is, the answer is somewhere between. So the Phanariot, the Musurus family, the Aristarchis, they serve the state almost like very loyally, reminding us of old pre-modern days of like this slave to master relationship. Whereas on the other hand, you see the exclusion on the military that really spans throughout the end of the empire, that really bars any Christians from serving in the military branches. So that's been said. What about the universal understanding of Greekness? And let's talk about the classes at the same time. So this is a question that I couldn't really answer. I'm really working on it because there are so many questions that I have on that. And I'm hoping someone will say, okay, there's an article there, just read it. So I'm still there because I found out that, I mean, in late 19th century, these foreigners in Ottoman Empire, let's say those who have native Ottomans, most of them are native Ottomans, who opted for foreign passports. There is no national identity cards back then, so passports were national identity cards. Let's say 84% of them are men. So why am I saying that? When we come to Neo-Hellenes, when we come to Greeks, it's 50%. 50%, I mean, technically speaking, for Izmir, the city that I'm in, is like 51% of Neo-Hellenes are women. What to make of it? I don't know. So you tell me. And when the expulsion orders in 1869 were circulated, there are like details description of the occupations of who were expelled. And most of them are not even middle class, lower classes. So they made an effort. So we can read this twofold. They made an effort, despite being in an economically vulnerable situation. They made an effort to acquire Greek protection. Why? I don't know. I'm looking at the occupation like shopkeepers, tavern owners. Let's treat them rising middle class, but also unmarried single men. why this guy, which is like in the fringes of our society, if you consider mid-19th century, went his way to acquire Greek nationality papers. And by the way, they still continue to pay taxes. This is not tax avoidance. So this may be in this very unsecure world that we cannot really understand in this 19th century mentality, that gave them at least some sort of a security and belonging. If it comes to that, they were hoping that some Greek diplomat in Izmir, in Salonika, in Istanbul, will intervene on their behalf, which is exploited by the diplomats, by the Greek diplomats on these cities as well. So these Greek diplomats were asking for like gold watches, for like their deeds of their houses to give them these passports. And even circulated rumors that there's an impending expulsion is coming, so that they had to go back to the missions to renew the certificates and get more money out of that. There are some names dropped, like Diligenis brothers, like Metaxas family is also involved, not the same Metaxas family, but you may read more about that in the article as well. So there is that point that I'm still, as I said, hoping someone in the audience just drops an article written in 1972 that really answers all these questions that I missed.
Thank you. And I think many of the things that you all said speak to one another's work. So is there anything you would like to ask one another before, like, for instance, listening to Berge, I kept thinking about Elisavet's work, right? And like that difference, the gender difference, which is fascinating, that speaks to your argument about class and all that. And in general, from all of your responses, with Anna's very justified concerns about what topics are we allowed to touch on, really, and how your work, which is groundbreaking, all of you, right, may contribute to, or rather this moment of all of us being together in like not only talking about transnationalism as an analytical tool, but also transnational historiography, like to help one another bypass some of the regional constraints that are everywhere. They're different, but they're everywhere, by creating new types of historiographical connections. And back to Ada's comment about vocabularies and the reinvention of vocabularies. To what extent is it useful, right, for us to use terms that make sense in one context but not necessarily in another, instead of focusing more on those excluded before making these connections from the mainstream discussions and so on and so forth. And I feel like Berge and I should talk in private because I have a special interest in your topic, clearly, but I don't want to ask any more questions on that. It is truly fascinating. Other than that, Alex, is there a follow-up question that you would like to address the panel with?
Not in particular, but I do think it's interesting to know too with this discussion of vocabulary, and this is a question I also often have to deal with, Berkeley, like what is liberalism, and trying to explain that to my students in the 19th century. But I think that between your paper and Ada's, we also see the way that it's almost a game of telephone in some ways, where, you know, what 1848, for example, meant to revolutionaries in Paris meant something very different to the Romanians and the Poles that were hanging out in the same library as them, right? You know, and so how these concepts change in the context is really important and can be often very misleading to us, right? And that this is part of the problem in telling this sort of story that I see as interconnected about 1821 and the decades that come afterwards would be the only sort of thing to underline. But I appreciate all of your answers very much as well. So
any questions you would like to address one another in order to initiate? Yes, Anna?
I would like to ask Elizabeth, it's more my curiosity. What we really lack is information and studies about the women in Greece, not only Greek, but also Albanian, Turkish women who suffered all during the war. The women at war in Greece, how they reacted, how they exploited them, how they managed to keep their families alive. There was an interesting project at Harvard University about women at war, not dealing with 1821. Of course, it was about current wars, but such a perspective would be most useful, and it has not been done. Now we have some books about women during in the revolution, but they mainly focus on these elite groups that were well educated, well established, had connections with the West, and could express themselves and be heard. I would very much love to see a study, since you have done all this work on women and you have all the theoretical tools necessary, to turn your attention also to the women that were in the middle of this wartime period for such a long time. Just a suggestion for further research, not a remark, really.
No, but this is lovely, and it kind of touches very much what I want to do. And I think I started off as an intellectual historian, so I was only looking at ideas. And then gradually I realized, first of all, yes, we see ideas by women of the elite because they had the ability to publish and write, and also their archives would be kept, of course. But I think they are just a trace of the ideas people had, the ideas women had. I think also think that we're missing a lot of archival work that should be done about women at war in Greece, because although there were a lot of publications this year, of course, normally, I just I feel we're still missing, and we know how difficult it is to find archives about women, especially women fighting. We only have some ideas from maybe songs.
I think there are interesting documents in the Justice Department, if we may call it that.
Yes,
there are complaints, and you can't have an insight of what was happening in the real world, in the Greek countryside at that time, with widows in quarrel with their neighbors for their land, etc. I think that could be a starting point.
Yes, I think so too. Yes. We should definitely discuss about this. It's very interesting. And I think it's not a gap only in Greek historiography. I think we're missing like a grand narrative about what women did at the age of revolutions. Because I think, as I said before, that they would be very, very stimulated by these ideas that promised some kind of freedom. And we know we have bits and pieces, but there's a lot of work ahead, and it's very exciting, I think.
And if I were to share with you in concluding some of like the general comments that were shared with us, inviting more contributions from you and expressing interest in your work, for instance, there is a project about Bouboulina, Elizabeth, that I think would be very relevant to you. There is a question/project about comparative federalism in the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Federation, or reimagining the Russian Federation before and post-revolution. Of course, the work that many scholars have started to do in Europe with regard to the rise of the far right, And again, anything from the Russian influence to the regional manifestations of this new phenomenon and reconceptualizations of history. So I think this is a good conclusion, or a fitting conclusion to this discussion, which was meant to be but a short invitation to introduce your work and to familiarize those interested with the different images, perceptions, and reconceptualizations of 1821 and revolution, or not, right, quote unquote, in general. I would like to say that we will share an edited version. Elizabeth, we can all sympathize. We will share an edited volume of the discussion on the Modern Greek Studies Association new YouTube channel. And hopefully we can initiate some more conversations there, as well as serve the main idea and mission of the association, which is to connect your work, your fascinating work, to the interests of others. Right, which you all did wonderfully for us today. So thank you so much. And to the remaining members of the audience, please stay tuned, because we will be sharing a number of new initiatives with you starting this summer. Okay, if we survive the pandemic, this new phase of the pandemic. Okay, so thank you so much. And if there is anything else, I will end the recording here with our thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.